Welcome everyone. I think a few others may come in but I think we'll get started with our history seminar. Please let me know in the chat at any time if you can't hear me or the speaker. I just want to briefly start by thanking you all for coming. This is the seminar of the History Department that was launched by my colleague Christopher Mohozy last year, and that we will be continuing in the new semester with a new set of speakers. And for the time being, we're very glad that Professor Jonathon Earle has agreed to present on his latest work surrounding the history of the Democratic Party and Benedicto Kiwanuka. I think many of you know Jonathon and are familiar with his work, but for those who aren't, I'll just very briefly say that Professor Earle is the author of Colonial Uganda and the End of Empire, Political Thought and Historical Imagination, which was published in 2017 with Cambridge University Press and was nominated for the prestigious Bethwal Agot Prize in East African History. And it's a sort of magisterial study of that focuses on four leaders in Uganda's political, religious, and social thought: Ignatius Musazi, Eridadi Mulira, Abubakar Mayanja, and Benedicto Kiwanuka. And Dr. Earle has expanded on that work in his most recent book, co-authored with James Carney, titled Contesting Catholics, Benedicto Kiwanuka and the Birth of Post-Colonial Uganda. Today he'll be presenting material which I believe is from that project, though expanding a bit into areas beyond Uganda and Kiwanuka, in a talk entitled Reimagining Religious Politics in Late Colonial Uganda, Benedicto Kiwanuka and Intra-Catholic Contestations during the election of 1962. So before I invite Dr. Earle to give his talk, I just want to briefly say how this Zoom format will work. If you could, as you have questions, if you could type them into the chat, and I will sort through them and then ask you to pose them directly through Zoom, or if you'd prefer, I can read them. But please do put them in the chat and raise your hand if I've missed you. And we will, before we get to that though, we're grateful to have a discussant from our own Makerere PhD student, Deo Kanamwanji, who will respond to Dr. Earle's presentation in about 5 minutes and open the floor for us for the discussion going forward. So I'd really, on behalf of the Department of History, Archaeology, and Heritage Studies, like to thank you for getting up so early. I know in the States it's 8 in the morning, and we're very glad to have you here with us virtually, and we hope that when this pandemic is over, you'll be here physically as well. So thank you very much, and let me hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Taylor, for that warm, generous introduction. Before I begin, are you able to see, is everyone able to see the photograph that I have on the screen?
I am able to see it. I can see it's the first slide of your presentation.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, good afternoon. I wish to begin by thanking Drs. Mohozy and Taylor for warmly welcoming me today. I also wish to thank each of you for taking the time to be here today. And last, I wish to thank Deo Kanamwangi, who has graciously agreed to be our discussant I look forward to listening and thinking alongside him. My paper today draws from a book project that I have been working on for the last several years, which is a history of the Democratic Party in Catholic politics in colonial Uganda. The book will be released in April, and as Edgar has noted, has been co-authored with Jay Carney. In my first book, I wanted to show the different ways in which historical and religious imagination was used by Uganda activists on the eve of independence. And let me first ask, can you hear me okay?
We can hear you, Prof.
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much. So in that book, I devoted one chapter to Benedicto Kiwanuka's conception of Amazima no Bwenkambia. But more than any other subject of the book, I left feeling dissatisfied with how little I spoke about the complexity of Catholic politics in Uganda, especially when the private papers of Benedicto Kiwanuka, upon which that chapter was largely based, spoke comprehensively about the inner debates that propelled the Democratic Party throughout the 1950s and throughout the 1960s. That absence compelled me to write an entire monograph on the subject of the Democratic Party with Jay Carney, which I hope will help us rethink how we understand the history of religious and democratic thought in Uganda. In my paper today, I wish to begin by providing an overview of the larger project and the ways in which it speaks to the existing literature. The book goes into some detail about rethinking Catholic studies in Africa. But today, I'm simply going to talk about the ways in which the project complicates Uganda's existing literature. After providing an overview, I then want to think closely about the political career of Cuthbert Obwangor, whose Catholic project, I argue, complicates many of the associations that are made in central and southern Uganda with the Democratic Party and the Catholic Church. Historiographically, my concern is that in colonial Uganda, the religious and political history of Teso land was overshadowed by historians and administrators who were obsessed with kingdoms. And in the post-colony, by contrast, Teso land has continued to be overlooked, mostly because of the attention that northern Uganda has attracted due to the Lord's Resistance Army, especially in the political science and international relations literature. I maintain that we have considerable work to do in reclaiming Teso narratives in Uganda's national history writing. So let us turn to a general overview of the project and then Uganda's national historiography. Benedicto Kiwanuka was Uganda's most controversial and disruptive politician of the 1950s and early 1960s, and the most important Catholic politician in 20th century Uganda. He was the country's first elected prime minister between 1961 and 1962, before he and his party were outflanked by opposition political alliances. Shortly after being released from prison for allegedly backing the assassination of President Milton Obote, he served as the country's first Ugandan Chief Justice between 1971 and 1972, when members of Idi Amin's security apparatus had him murdered or assassinated him. And here we see Kiwanuka and Idi Amin. Idi Amin is being photobombed in the front, but this was shortly before Benedicto Kiwanuka's assassination. Kiwanuka provided the most original, far-sighted political thinking in late colonial Uganda. The resuscitation of his career demonstrates the extent to which Ugandans have a heritage of politics that is more than eating power or the state, what Jean Baer described as le politique du ventre, the politics of the belly. Kiwanuka's activism and intellectual history helps us understand in new ways how arguments about pluralism, electoral democracy unfolded in late colonial Uganda. Ideas about truth and justice were foundational political and theological ideals that evoked regional ruptures and solidarities. Activists and organizers operating in different parts of the country intentionally underscored different aspects of the ideals of truth and justice to imagine political possibilities in the post-colony. This project seeks to recover the power, possibilities, and pitfalls of Benedicto Kiwanuka's and the Democratic Party's Catholic, liberal, democratic nationalism in independence-era Uganda. It demonstrates the complicated ways in which ethnic, religious, and regional identities overlapped, coexisted, and collided, while also reinforcing the importance of local politics and DP's and Kiwanuka's struggle to conceive the nation. Shaped by his own Uganda Catholic roots, as well as international Christian democracy, Kiwanuka helped to mold the DP into a viable nationalist alternative to the Uganda People's Congress in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Although deeply grounded in Uganda's Catholic community, though, the Democratic Party was never simply a sectarian Catholic party, contrary to what its critics at the time and later scholars have often assumed. In fact, although DP remained a primary vehicle for the mobilization of Catholic voters, its political appeal rested in part in how its vision stretched beyond defending sectarian religious interests. Namely, Kiwanuka and DP sought to create a nationalist movement that would expand political participation, advocate for social justice, and challenge Uganda's entrenched socio-political hierarchies. Despite its national aspirations, Kiwanuka's and DP's project was, in fact, constrained by the regional politics of the period. In ways that were enriched by local variety and change, Catholics across party boundaries asked for fairness, openness, inclusion, and self-sacrifice. But again, what this all meant looked drastically different across time and space. In much of Uganda's political history writing, the Democratic Party is cast as a Catholic party that sought to upend political Protestantism in the Kingdom of Uganda. Catholic politics, though, constituted a dynamic moral economy of competing regional historical visions and competing political claims. By pushing the boundaries of the Democratic Party beyond Uganda and what has long been viewed as Kiwanuka's anti-royalist bent, the project hopes to recover the various political possibilities with which Uganda's Catholic activists imagined a post-colonial future. So let's turn to Uganda's national history writing. Politics of the 1950s and the 1960s drew on particular narratives of the country's religious past. These histories emphasize kingship and conquest, expropriation and dissent, and people's search for religious knowledge, patrons, and cosmopolitan opportunities. For most writers in Buganda, interpreting Uganda's late colonial moment, the state of Uganda, or the Ugandan state, did not unravel until 1966, where we see here in this photograph the military storming the compound of the Kabaka. But this is not how Benedicto Kiwanuka viewed Uganda's political history. For Kiwanuka and his party colleagues, Uganda was a de facto Protestant state that existed at the expense of Catholics and Muslims. Uganda's moment of independence, far from being an occasion for Pan-African optimism, was the culmination, he argued, of decades of violence and religious discrimination. So how is Uganda's national story typically told? In conventional historiography, the year 1966 is the keystone that holds Uganda's post-colonial history writing intact. The historian Faris Mutibwa argues that the crises of 1966 can be viewed as a definitive watershed in the history of post-independence Uganda. Some may see it as the beginning of Uganda's agonies, when a time when things begin to fall apart. Mutibwa's language is insightful. He draws from Chinua Achebe, but unlike Chinua Achebe, does not associate the states falling apart with the beginning of colonial rule. For Mutibwa, social order falls apart in 1966. For Professor Abdul Kasozi, similarly, the 1966 crises, he argued, ended 500 years of Ugandan and African history. It signified, as he titled his work on the topic, the social origins of violence in Uganda. By contrast, if 1966 constituted a moment when Uganda's social order became unhinged, Uganda in the late 1950s was supposedly characterized by an age of manners and courtesy, as David Apter would have it, a time when politeness covers up the ambitions of men. These standard historical summaries, though, in addition to overlooking political perspectives beyond central Uganda, disregard the experiences of violence that frequented anti-DP politics during the 1950s and the 1960s. And here we have a photograph that was taken with myself and Mr. Sam Foster, who is actually with us today, of the Kabaka's residence during which he was in exile following the 1966 attack on the compound. Standard accounts, they also fail to take into account the force of royalist Catholic politics in Uganda and the numerous Catholic political alternatives that circulated throughout the country. Kiwanuka's Uganda, in other words, it was not a place of manners and hidden aspirations. It was a fierce field of immense contestation and public duress. The state for Kiwanuka did not fall apart in 1966. For Kiwanuka, such notions were mythological. They were royalist fabrications that disregarded the perspective of Catholic communities for whom the state, for 7 decades, was largely a facade over political realities that were far less pleasant. So what did Kiwanuka's Uganda look like if it did not fall apart in 1966? By 1962, just as Apter was reflecting on the ubiquity of political nicety in Buganda and political nicety throughout Uganda, Benedicto Kiwanuka was filing complaints and reports to the Criminal Investigation Department of the Ugandan Police Headquarters. His reports concern the practice of government-led violence and intimidation. Between January the 1st and December the 20th of 1962, there were no fewer than 639 offenses committed against DP supporters, 498 of which were prosecuted and 306 convicted. One DP report noted that in Makerere, like other areas throughout Uganda, chiefs used to pass between the lines of voters and threaten them that if they voted, they would be removing their kabaka from the throne, and that they would be killed and their bodies would be exhumed along with those of DP members. And this became a common threat during the period, the way in which Kabaka Yeka supporters in particular would argue to DP supporters that if you supported the DP, we would actually remove you from your butaka and relocate you from your ancestral burial grounds. Kabaka Yeka's words were not idle, Kiwanuka maintained. The kingdom's royalists, whom Kiwanuka dubbed as quote-unquote barbarians, were fulfilling strategies to kill our followers and to rape our women supporters. Outside of Uganda, scholars have been more willing to acknowledge the histories of anti-DP and anti-Catholic violence in late colonial Uganda. Dan Mudola, following other writers, has argued that Uganda's late colonial moment included the widespread harassment of members of the Democratic Party. Mudola concludes that independence found a sour and alienated Catholic community, as evidenced by subsequent utterances and developments. Karugire suggests that the entire police force of the Uganda Protectorate could not have prevented crop slashing, house burning, livestock maiming, and various acts of arson, which were normally perpetrated at night against those adjudged to be disloyal to the Kabaka. On Kiwanuka's legal expertise, while in exile between 1953 and 1955, members of the DP were seen as traitors to Uganda. They became and remained the most insulting of swear words. And here we have a personal image that Mutesa presented to Benedicto Kiwanuka with this lovely inscription at the bottom where His Excellency Kabaka Mutesa was For Kiwanuka, Uganda's independence was not a cause for celebration. In contrast, it compelled him to reflect extensively on what he called the desolation of the state. And here did not fall apart in 1966. It was never fully put together in the first place. But despite the significant three partisan histories have been written about Kiwanuka and the Democratic Party. In 1984, Democratic Party activists produced two accounts, one in Uganda, one campaign of Paul Makerere during the 1980s. Nearly 10 years later, the Ugandan historian Albert Bade, rest in peace, published a sympathetic biography of Kiwanuka, during which he presented Kiwanuka the righteous and uncompromising figure who rejected the marriages of convenience and resisted the temptation to join those who controlled power and resources. Other scholars have largely ignored Kiwanuka and his legacy in modern Ugandan politics. David Apter offered only one passing statement about Kiwanuka, whom he simply described as a well-known Kampala lawyer. Drawing from private collections, regional archives, oral interviews, and vernacular and regional newspapers, it became apparent that there was no universal political Catholicism around or singular political ideology around which the Democratic Party could unify to overcome its political opponents. However strongly the Central Committee of the Democratic Party wished to impose a common agenda. And before I turn to the history of Catholicism in Eastern Uganda and the political biography of Cuthbert Obwangor, I wish to conclude this overview by offering a brief outline of the chapters of the book project, which illustrate the complexity of Catholic claims during this period throughout Uganda. Chapter 1 introduces Benedicto Kiwanuka's early biography and the Catholic and political context that shaped his emerging sensibilities. Kiwanuka's religious convictions and conception of liberal democracy emerged out of his identification with each of Uganda's 3 Catholic missions, whose leaders were French, English, Dutch, Italian, and most importantly, Ugandan. Chapter 2, from which the following section of the paper will draw, moves Kiwanuka and the Democratic Party beyond the conventional stories of southern Uganda by comparing and contrasting the political histories of Tesoland and Rwenzururu. Chapter 3 shows how the Lost Counties controversy emerged out of a time when Buganda's Catholic chiefs and converts of the late 19th century used violence to eat the southern counties of Bunyoro. In an effort to build Catholic solidarities across the Buganda-Bunyoro border, Kiwanuka was obliged to support the return of the counties to Bunyoro, a choice that drew inspiration from a Inyoro Historical Research Society and a decision that also drew inspiration from his Inyoro family connections. While the DP was associated with returning land to Bunyoro Chitara, the party was affiliated in Chigezi with the cause of Bachiga farmers, Bahutu migrants, and a Republican revolution that was unfolding across the border in Rwanda. Chapter 4 rethinks the genealogies of Ugandan nationalism by exploring sectarian politics in the northern Ugandan regions of Acholiland and West Nile. DP activists in Acholiland helped initially secure the premiership of Kiwanuka, but Catholic alliances could not be taken for granted. The highest concentration of Catholics in Uganda lived in West Nile, where the DP actually lost the parliamentary election. In Ankole, Catholic activists and the DP backed the cause of the Ankole monarchy, resulting in the appointment of a Catholic prime minister in 1961 in Ankole. The power of DP leadership in Ankole resulted in an alliance that sought to upend Kiwanuka's hold on power. To maintain his grip on leadership, Kiwanuka would return to Acholiland, whose delegates ensured that Kiwanuka would live to fight another day and hold on to the leadership of the party. Chapter 5 explores two of the more consequential Catholic alternatives in 1950s Buganda, and the politics of patrimony and patriarchal authority again in Buganda. It begins by looking at the politics of the Catholic radical, the seminarian, the former Catholic seminarian, Simakula Malumba, before turning to the royalism or the popular royalism of Aloysius Darlington Lubowa, where we see him here to the left with Basude and Katikiro Makerere Chintu. Lubowa was responsible for helping compel the vast majority of Catholics in Buganda to join or support not the Democratic Party, but Kabaka Yeka. Chapter 6 shows that Ugandan politics during the late 1950s and 1960s was not an exercise in unmitigated optimism during an allegedly golden age of African nationalism. It was an emotional parade of fits and starts shaped by reflections and debates about death and political and religious martyrdom. Like the Ugandan martyrs, Kiwanuka believed that he was the leader of a persecuted movement. With growing concerns about his life, Kiwanuka's remaining private papers show us that he increased his life insurance policies, he purchased a pistol, and he had protective fencing placed around his home. Kiwanuka argued for the importance of what he described as prophetic resistance in expectation of God's deliverance, a legacy that Bobby Wine has built upon. In summary, Uganda experienced a profound political crisis at the inception of the state that revolved around Benedicto Kiwanuka and the Democratic Party. And here is why I think this study matters within the larger study of Catholic politics throughout Eastern Africa and indeed the world. In Eastern Africa's historiography, it has been argued, I would suggest problematically, that Uganda did not experience a late colonial crisis that served as a cause for national unification. In contrast to Kenya's Mau Mau, Rwanda's political revolution, or even Tanzania's formation around a unified language and the integration of Zanzibar. And here we see Benedicto Kiwanuka with Julius Nyerere and Tom Mboya, and then in the photograph on the right, two aspiring Catholic activists, Benedicto Kiwanuka and John F. Kennedy. This book project, by contrast, suggests that the politics of Benedicto Kiwanuka and the DP were far more consequential in propelling Uganda's nationalist politics than has been previously understood. Like birthing, the politics of late colonial Uganda was loosely predictable, it was bloody, it was excruciating, and it was hopeful. So let us turn now to colonial administration and the history of Catholic politics in Eastern Uganda. It was the Uganda military general Sime Kakungulu who incorporated Eastern Uganda into the Protectorate of Uganda during the early 20th century. The name that Uganda elites and colonial administrators used to first describe Eastern Uganda was Bukedi, a pejorative term that described the land of the naked people. One colonial administrator summarized, Bukedi encapsulated the unsubdued and unclad tribesmen who lived on the east side of the Nile opposite. As Ron Atkinson has shown, accentuating differences between the Baganda and others and representing such difference as inherently tribal served to justify the unequal distribution of capital and infrastructural development that marked the special relationship between the British and the Baganda. Michael Twaddle's research on the biography of Seme Kakungulu convincingly demonstrates that Buganda's military administrators struggled to effectively govern the communities that inhabited eastern Uganda, which encompassed the Iteso, Uganda's second largest ethnic community. Kakungulu undermined age-set ceremonies in particular, which Iteso had used in the past to regulate generational authority and organize migration and military campaigns. Uganda Protestant administrators also failed to learn Ateso, which only reinforced the skepticism and the ire of Teso chiefs, many of whom resisted Protestant, forms of Christianity. The attempt to create centralized power in Teso land instigated considerable debates throughout the colonial period. Many Iteso viewed the region's colonial chiefs as wielding authority that their positions did not afford in the past. Regional apprehensions were particularly seen in debates around gender and sexuality. Chiefs that used their privilege to demand sexual services were imorok, or emuron, a term used to describe witch doctors or night dancers. In November 1948, Iteso in the village of Kanyumu, Kumi, petitioned the district officer to come immediately and save us from the work of the sub-county chief. The chief was accused of being, quote, very much after the women of the peasants, which is a disgraceful thing in the whole of our etem, or sub-county. For a man who sleeps with a woman in the bush is, according to our native customs, regarded as a witch doctor, end quote. Following their opening critique, the writers of the letter articulated the following, quote, the sub-county chief has misled the Kanyum Etem court in getting bribes, and for this reason, cases are not cut justly. He has a tendency of awarding too much compensation and less fines. He uses prisoners to cultivate his own shambas and does keep them in his lockup for more than a month. He shouts too much in the court as if he is mad. Sir, get him examined medically at Ngora, for the man might also run mad, and we Kanyum people will be held responsible, end quote. The writers concluded by criticizing the appointment of chiefs who were selected without our knowledge and are transferred without saying a word of goodbye to us. The letter from Kanyumu described a political order described by judicial obstruction, forced labor, sexual impropriety, and mental instability. The quote, end quote, madman of Teso, Makerere, a term that Catholic communities in Teso also used to describe an incessantly boisterous person, lacked sociability and lacked the necessary skills to depart with grace. Protestantism failed to become Tesoland's predominant form of colonial Christianity. The book argues, I would argue in this paper, because it was too closely associated with the high-handed behavior of colonial chiefs and an earlier generation of Uganda administrators. Missionaries with St. Joseph's Society, or the Mill Hill Fathers, began working in eastern Uganda by the early 1900s. By the end of 1920, there were approximately 20,000 students enrolled in Mill Hill secondary schools, numbers that were only marginally less than rates for the Church Missionary Society and the White Fathers throughout the entire country. Uganda's 1959 census showed that 33% of the population was Catholic, nearly 11% more than Protestant. As I will now show, one of the reasons why the Mill Hill Project expanded in Tesoland was that converts interpreted the mission's political objective in ways that reverberated with the region's older ideas about egalitarianism in the region. So Cuthbert Joseph Obwangor, whom we see here to our left, Milton Obote's left, was one of the most important Catholic intellectuals to emerge out of Uganda's Mill Hill community. He was born in 1920 in the northern Teso region of Katakwi. After studying in the Mill Hill Primary School in Ingora, Obwangor enrolled at Namiliango College, which was founded by the Mill Hill Fathers in 1902. According to Obwangor, he was sent to England for 1 year during his studies to become fully fluent in English, which would enable him to help with the translation work of the Mill Hill mission. After completing Namiliongo, Obwangor worked for the Kenya and Uganda Railways and harbors in Nairobi before studying accountancy at the London School of Economics. He returned to Tesoland by the early 1950s, after which he became involved in farmer union politics and in time, the establishment of the UPC in Tesoland. He was appointed Minister of Justice by the ruling party, the UPC, in 1964. By the mid-1960s, he was Minister of Commerce and Industry and Treasurer of the UPC. And after Milton Obote abrogated Uganda's independence constitution in 1967, Obwangor joined the Democratic Party, with which he was associated during his arrest in 1969, following the failed assassination of Milton Obote. For Obwangor, the UPC had by the late 1960s overextended its reach by the late 1960s. After the 1970s, Yoweri Museveni and the National Resistance Movement often claimed Obwangor as one of their own to bolster the NRM's fledgling support in Tesoland following the Loweto conflict and the Kumi massacre in 1989. The Teso activists' arguments, though, for multi-partyism created evident tension within the NRM, a point that Museveni himself openly acknowledged after Obwangor's death in 2012. Obwangor's political biography developed during a time when Tesoland was generating large amounts of capital on account of its cattle and due to the production of colonial cotton. As an indication of its wealth, J. Lawrence, who served as Teso District's commissioner for 5 years following the Second World War, noted that Teso was the largest cigarette-consuming district in colonial Eastern Africa. Like other areas in Uganda, the Indian management of land and generaries raised considerable consternation throughout Tesoland. The colonial archives contain numerous report letters of complaint submitted by Teso farmers against Indian traders. Indians were criticized for circulating gossip about Teso elders and for their inabilities to herd cattle, which, when not corralled properly, trampled local crops. By the mid-1950s, public criticism focused extensively on the Indian monopolization of land, especially in Teso's urban trading centers, Colonial officials worried that grievances and the expansion of trade unions in Tesoland would translate into interracial friction with Eastern Uganda's Indian communities who possessed predominance in the retail trade. To undermine the dominance of Indian economies, trade unions expanded rapidly in post-war Tesoland. The Uganda organizers Ignatius Musazi and Erieza Bwete, who had established Uganda's first trade unions, were active campaigners in eastern Uganda. Throughout both Tesoland and central Uganda, Musazi and Bwete underscored the seizure of land in Kenya by settlers to compel Ugandans to organize local trade unions. For Teso farmers, or to two Teso farmers, they argued, since the Mau Mau are successful in driving white men out of the Kenya highlands, the Europeans are preparing to seize land in Uganda. The argument gained extensive traction throughout Tesoland. As one colonial official worryingly noted, the story has wide currency, and I have heard it as much as 60 miles from Soroti's center of activity. Trade unions facilitated political solidarity between Teso communities and communities throughout Uganda. And through the doors of trade unions passed most of Teso's first generation of national officials, including the founding members of the UPC and Cuthbert Obwangor, who throughout the 1950s and the 1960s drafted the majority of Teso's orders of business and cooperative complaints in Entebbe and Kampala. But Obwangor did not advocate for a strong centralized government, at least in ways that were developed by the UPC following Milton Obote's socialist move to the left in the late 1960s. Nor did Obwangor share Musazi's and Bwete's Protestant convictions. Obwangor's electoral success was due in large part to his ability to identify with older ideas throughout the region about mobility and flattened hierarchies. Generally speaking, Teso activists throughout the 20th century rallied against hierarchical politics and the centralization of social authority. Unlike the Catholicism of the White Fathers or the Protestantism of the CMS, the Mill Hill Mission was not particularly interested in eating chieftaincies. The Mill Hill Mission itself was invited to work in Uganda precisely because it was hoped that its English-speaking missionaries would mediate tensions between Francophone Catholics and British Protestants. Their task was to attenuate competing political hierarchies in the state, not reify them. For Teso converts, ideas about egalitarianism were reworked according to local political priorities. First, and then used to make larger claims about how authority and economies ought to work in the state more broadly. When Obwangor began writing in the national press in the late 1950s and early 1960s, he advocated for an inclusive populist state. This was his vision for power in Uganda. One editorial is especially insightful. In November 1960, he argued that all power exercised over a nation must come from the political community, and power which is assumed is usurpation. For Obwangor, the Constitution becomes a political Bible of the state to the extent that it enables people to decide freely while also weakening the tendency of governments to regulate their citizens' affairs. Obwangore's argument was not libertarian. He was in fact building upon much older discourses circulating in Teso land about distributive power. The argument was in turn well received. As one Northern Teso supporter ingratiatingly commented, "Mr. Cuthbert Obwangore is the best representative Teso has ever had, in that he has proved himself before the Teso intelligentsia and above all the peasants by consistence, common sense, and leadership." Obwangore's egalitarian ethos set the political terms within which the DP was compelled to organize in the region. In numerous contexts, DP organizers in the area employed strategies that sought to demonstrate inclusivity and political mobility. In Soroti town, extensive efforts were made to rotate party members, to attract followers, and to demonstrate that they were not attempting to use their party to monopolize landholdings, which was an accusation levied much earlier against Gonda chiefs, and more recently in that time against Indian merchants and the African Muslim Association. More broadly, the strategy of inclusive mobility built upon the local historiographies of regional migration. Teso communities had begun settling in eastern Uganda following a series of migrations from the 18th century onward. The word, as we will all know, Teso, was derived from the older glas ates, or child, a word that was used to distinguish younger migrating communities from the old men who stayed behind, or the Karamajong, derived from ekar, to stay behind, or imajong, the old men. While there is much about this much earlier period that we do not fully understand in terms of the political and economic transitions of the period, it is generally acknowledged that a critique of central authority accompanied Teso's aspiring youth. Ideas about mobility were reworked into strategies of organization. Between 1957 and 1962, Catholic activists in the DP, writing from the Mill Hill mission of Toroma, orchestrated meetings at local, multiple locations. Assembly sites included throughout Teso, the Luchico Hall, the African Club, a garden between the post office, cinema, various trees, and a large mango tree near the main market. From these locations, the party sought to remedy what the Gonda DP leader, Paul Semogerere, had controversially called apathy in Teso land. From their mango trees and Catholic mission, the party structured speaking tours throughout areas that included Amuria, Mukedia, Serere, Usuk, Kabaramaido, and Kalaki. To reinforce local canvassing, Benedicto Kiwanuka toured Teso land in late 1961 and early 1962, but his visit was nothing short of a failure. If anything, Kiwanuka's tour undermined the success of DP. Even Teso members of DP raised concern or complaints about Kiwanuka's speeches and private correspondence between party executives and Kiwanuka. The speeches, they complained, were conducted in Luganda, which prevented voters from understanding what he was arguing. For ordinary Iteso, Kiwanuka's persona resembled an earlier generation of Gonda chiefs, who used Luganda to dictate Southern political interests. Like an earlier generation of Uganda administrators, Kiwanuka did not seem especially interested in appropriating local cultural practices. His tour also coincided with the string of arsons against Anglican churches in Kumi, allegedly carried out by DP Catholics. In response, one UPC Youth Wing activist in Tesoland commented, "Religious rivalry in the district has never been so bad." The politics of opposition associated with the DP was rejected in eastern Uganda. Although Catholics constituted the majority of the population in Teso, the DP was unable to secure Teso's national elections. In the principal parliamentary elections of 1961 and 1962 respectively, UPC outpolled DP in Teso by 22,000 votes and 11,000 votes. DP activists and Kiwanuka, like an earlier generation of colonial chiefs, were viewed as being too boisterous. The strategy of rotating meeting points was not enough to disassociate the DP and Benedicto Kiwanuka from the longer history of Uganda's political and cultural mishaps in the area. So in conclusion, why did the DP fail to carry the Catholic vote in Tesoland? As we have begun to see, Obwangor, a son of the soil, advocated for a type of republicanism that left DP activists without a compelling political narrative. These communities believed he would move Tesoland into the forefront of national politics. While Tesoland had been a significant producer of cotton and cattle in the colonial economy, it was politically marginalized until the early 1960s. In turn, there was not a compelling reason for ordinary Teso Catholics to join a party that was associated with Uganda Catholics, Benedicto Kiwanuka in particular. Despite the region's Catholic associations, it was hard to imagine that local interests could be championed by Uganda politicians, and Kiwanuka was unable to disassociate himself from an earlier generation of Uganda colonial administrators. Shared colonial identity ultimately proved no match for ethnic loyalties and persuasive local political narratives. More broadly, what the history of religious politics in Eastern Uganda begins to show is that the earlier political base of the UPC, pejoratively titled the United Protestants of Canterbury, was far more religiously diverse than has often been assumed. At the heart of UPC's popularity in Tesoland were Catholic efforts, seen in the likes of Cuthbert Obwangor's, to rework longer histories of inclusion and mobility. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that very rich presentation. For those of you who've joined a bit late, Dr. Earle's just finished. We'll have a discussion now by Deo Kanamwanji, who is a lecturer at Kampala International University and is finishing his dissertation with our department at Makerere, entitled From Mission to Local Church, A History of the Indigenization of the Catholic Church in Uganda, 1913 to 2012. So Deo, if you'd like to unmute yourself, you'll have about 5 minutes or so to offer some comments on Dr. Earle's presentation and open the floor for our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doctor. I must also thank, first and foremost, our presenter today, Professor Jonathon, for this wonderful paper and the way he has presented it. It's quite rich, quite incisive, mind-blowing, and I think it goes a long way in not only understanding the intricacies of our independence struggle, but also the politics and the complexities of our heritage that fused so much politics into the region and vice versa. I must thank him again for bringing this issue that has been, not so much covered in our historiography. The aspect of trying to look at some of the histories of the key actors of this history that has been neglected in most of our histories. I just want to make very quick comments because I have limited time. First, I'll run to the beginning and the inception of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party, from inception, is formed to fight historical injustice. Historical injustice are basically over spoils of politics. And I think that is what informs even their motto, Amazima no Wenkanya. If you ask yourself, who had denied the Catholics or the Baganda for this matter, this justice that the party is formed to address. So there is a key element here that we must really pick, that from inception, DP's issues are not doctrinal. They are just using religion to rally support, like the paper mentions, and also position themselves for better participation in local government, in gaining grants from their schools, in employment, in scholarship, and even gaining status. So this is a very critical aspect that we must speak. And when it comes to Kiwanuka and his rise to the harem of DP, still it seems it's this kind of I don't know how to call it, of marginalization, if I may use that the Catholics failed, that he comes to crusade for the same agenda of trying to see how the Catholics can also benefit from the resources of the country, which the state and the Protestant church seemed to favor towards the Anglican believers. So and this goes on and brings Kiwanuka into conflict with several organs, several people. For example, the political state. For example, the Meng establishment. For example, other political parties like UPC and the rest. But by and large, this is a history that we've been missing. This is a history that we need. But before I conclude, I would like to also, perhaps, I know Prof will think about it. There are so many ideas. For example, the idea of Cuthbert Obwangol coming into this. Doesn't it crowd the otherwise the good flowing story of Kiwanuka and his DP? Can't we have an independent paper that particularly covers that? And two, given Kiwanuka's politics, yes, to many, he was considered controversial, he was considered disruptive, he was considered conflictual, But don't you think that maybe Uganda was not ready for that kind of politician? And could that also be the reason for the not so easy, times that he had as a politician in Uganda? Lastly, I've really enjoyed your historical approach, the sources report, and so on. And I've seen a lot of works of senior historians in this country, but I've not seen Professor Kabwejiri's book, Politics of State Destruction and Formation. I think it would also be a very good, reference point in this kind of study. Otherwise, I must thank you. I thank you so much for the time you put in to have this kind of, idea brought into this kind of paper that I think the academic world will enjoy reading. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Deo, for those comments. I can see there's already a couple of questions in the chat, but I wonder if John, if you'd like to just say a couple of words in response to Deo's comments. There were a number of them there. One of them is maybe asking about I guess if I can reframe this in a bit, your approach as a historian of political thinkers and activists. You've in this paper, you've woven together Kiwanuka with Obwangor in this story of how DP politics in Tesoland. And I just wonder what sort of the architecture of an independent intellectual history of Obwangor would look like. And sort of maybe you can talk a bit about your methods as well. Thank you. Oh, you're on mute. So.
Thank you. I wish to thank Dale for your excellent comments, which have provided me with a number of helpful suggestions and helpful points to think about. So I think it is certainly the case that Cuthbert Obwangor warrants his own monograph, his own study. I am currently unaware of anyone who is working on a biography of Cuthbert Obwangor, but I think it is a study that would help illuminate the colonial politics of Eastern Uganda and Tesoland in particular. And I hope that somebody will take up that project, and someone might be interested to find out if also Cuthbert Obwangor left behind a large amount of private papers that can take us into the interior of his political and economic project, especially as it changes over time. And I think for me, that was part of the initial interest with Obwangor, that his politics, like so many, was anything but static, that it was robustly pro-UPC up until the mid-1960s, when he begins to push definitively away from the party, culminating in his arrest in 1969 alongside Benedicto Kiwanuka. So the way in which Obwangor is further incorporated into the Democratic Party throughout the late 1960s, I think this is a really important question. It's one that I've not been able to unearth the sources to fully comprehensively understand that incorporation and kind of the post-colonial career of Cuthbert Obwangor. I think for this particular project, my interest was, that often how Benedicto Kiwanuka had been talked about is that he developed these very lofty ideas of amazima no bwenkanya, truth and justice, but that he was very quickly sidelined by the power of popular royalism in the kingdom of Uganda. And then outside of Uganda, the UPC was able to dominate the rest of the country in this political electoral alignment between KY and UPC. But getting into the interior of Kiwanuka's private papers, it showed that there was extensive correspondence, as one would imagine, between executive branches throughout the country as part of a large, massive political campaigning strategy in the late 1950s. And it had intrigued me, why did the Democratic Party fail to solicit control in Teso land when the community was majority Catholic? And certainly that very quickly began to break down or problematize a lot of the arguments that circulated within southern Uganda that, right, the Democratic Party is Dini ya Papa, it's the religion of the Pope. It really only appealed to Catholics, when in fact that was not the case, that the UPC could equally appeal to Catholics, KY could appeal to Catholics, and also there were ways in which Protestants and Muslims were developing political solidarities with the Democratic Party. As noted in the paper, Cuthbert Obwangord was incredibly effective at advocating for what one might call was a radical egalitarianism, that simply Kiwanuka was unable to do so by virtue of history and by also virtue of his kind of high-strung managerial practices and very abrasive personality. What I don't talk about in the paper is there was a well-publicized event in the early 1900s when Apollo Kagwa and Hamu Mukasa will visit Teso land in the eastern sections of Uganda, and it received a considerable amount of attention in both the English and the Luganda press as well. And there were ways in which by the 1950s, Teso intellectuals were remembering that event to talk about Benedicto Kiwanuka. So again, it was fascinating that what I found insightful was that in Teso land, Benedicto Kiwanuka was very quickly being associated with the likes of Hamu Mukasa and Apollo Kagwa, whereas certainly in Buganda, that association would tend to not be made. Associating, Benedicto Kiwanuka has often been associated with Stanislas Mugwanya, with kind of a longer history of Catholic politics in the region, and certainly not Apollo Kagwa and Hamu Mukasa. So I think, for me, that's what I was trying to unearth in this particular context, was the type of intellectual project that Obwangord created, which really created a context within which Kiwanuka was forced to operate, within which the Democratic Party was forced to operate, and they were unable to successfully overcome those hurdles, so to speak. Yeah, but an excellent point, excellent question.
Thank you. So there's a number of comments and questions already in the chat, and please feel free to add your comments to the chat, and then I will ask you to pose them directly to Dr. Earle, unless you just prefer for him to answer directly. There's a question from Galabuzi Mukasa about sort of asking you to take this history up into the present day. And I wonder if, to interregnum in there, I was struck in looking at that photograph of Benedicto Kiwanuka with John F. Kennedy. Here are two Catholic leaders who were both assassinated in positions of power. And if I'm correct, the Kiwanuka was assassinated in 1972, which is that the same year as the Kigezi Conference, which some historians sort of point to as a turning point in how religion was used in Ugandan politics. And similarly with Kennedy, there's a transformation in how religion is a political force in Ugandan politics, or sorry, in American politics after his assassination. So I wonder if you could sort of take this story through what, the significance of Kiwanuka's assassination and sort of the afterlife of the DP into the present.
That's an excellent question. And this is a question that a number of us are better equipped to address than I am. I conducted interviews with founding members of the DP who operated with the Democratic Party throughout the 1970s when it went underground, and who also sought to revive the party in the 1980s. And the general sense in public memory is that the Democratic Party was never quite able to recover from the 1980 election. And that after that, once the NRM secured political power, that they were effective in incorporating a number of leading Catholic intellectuals into the infrastructure of the NRM. So there is a large amount of defection taking place from the DP to the NRM, and the party has, many would argue, have never recovered. So John Mary Waligo, for example, becomes a leading constitutional reformer in the NRM in the 1990s. So I do wonder, and I would be interested to hear other people react to this. In some ways, I feel that Bobby Wine and the type of political and religious rhetoric that Bobby Wine has articulated over the course of the past year has actually been quite consistent with the longer argument of Benedicto Kiwanuka, even in ways that are more observable than Norbert Mau's political discourse and political activism. And I noted that within the last 2 weeks, Bobby Wine was in the Soroti Catholic Cathedral. He, unlike Benedicto Kiwanuka, spoke in Lungereza, in English, as opposed to Luganda, and was very well received in the Soroti Cathedral, unlike Benedicto Kiwanuka. So in many ways, I think Kiwanuka's mantle is carried forward in the type of redemptive politics that Bobby Wine is arguing for, and particularly in Bobby Wine's insistent discussion about liberation. And when one listens to Bobby Wine closely, he consistently talks about our liberation is close at hand, our liberation is near. And some might argue that that's just pragmatic. Some might argue that that's just expedient politics that you make during a time of election in trying to oust the NRM from power. But as that might be the case, but I do also think it is the case that Bobby Wine is drawing from a much longer Catholic political tradition. If others have thoughts on that, I would be really interested to hear this. But in short, my reading is the Democratic Party has not recovered from the 1980 election and the NRM's ability to co-opt the leadership of the party. And again, if there are other opinions on that, I would be very interested to hear them. Excellent question.
Thank you. I know if anyone has a response to that, please feel free to jump in. I'd like to ask Jonathon Earle, I don't know if you'd like to pose your question yourself. You have a comment here about asking about this relationship between Kiwanuka and the Kabaka between the 1950s and 1960s. Jonathon, if you're there, if you'd like to ask your question, otherwise, perhaps.
Thank you, Curtis, and I thank you very much, Dr. Earle, for that wonderful presentation. I was very, very delighted to learn a huge chunk of history that you made possible, for us today. I note, particularly from one of the photographs you shared from your presentation, a handwritten note to Kiwanuka of a photograph of Kabaka Mutesa II, I think in exile, thanking him for his legal assistance during those very difficult years. And then through the 60s, when Kiwanuka seems to have some sort of some sort of fringy relationship with the Kabaka over, I think, maybe authority or other matters altogether. I needed to hear more about how that influenced the Kabaka's view of DP politics, notwithstanding his support to Kiwanuka through the years of his studies in England, and notwithstanding that the Kabaka himself was Protestant or Anglican and Kiwanuka was Catholic in the mainstream of politics of Uganda then.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for that excellent question. So during the 1953 to 1955 exile, there are ways in which both Benedicto Kiwanuka and Simakula Mulumba had been called upon to serve the Kabaka and had worked very closely with the Kabaka during his exile. And at that time, Benedicto Kiwanuka saw this as an opportunity once and for all to demonstrate to Buganda and Uganda that Catholics could be relied upon to serve the state in ways that had not been argued prior. This was Kiwanuka's thinking. And certainly at that time, he had in mind audiences throughout Buganda in particular. Where things really began to head in a sour direction, there were two major events that solidified Benedicto Kiwanuka's undoing in Buganda. And one of which was when the Luchiko called for the Democratic Party to boycott the general elections in the late 1950s, they refused. In the early 1960s, excuse me. And by failing to boycott the elections when the Luchiko was calling for this actively, it was at that point that we began to see the DP referred to as traitors and particularly calls of violence against Benedicto Kiwanuka. And A.D. Lubowa, Aloysius Lubowa said, once Benedicto Kiwanuka was elected prime minister, there were Protestants on the floor of the Luchiko who publicly said, we cannot be ruled by a Catholic now that Uganda has come to independence. And that those types of arguments were being said openly on the floor of the Luchiko. And Lubowa, a very, very devout Catholic, of course, found himself in a very difficult position of not always knowing how to navigate that. But the second event that was Kiwanuka's undoing was the Lost County controversy. Benedicto Kiwanuka was a strong proponent of the return of Mubende to Bunyoro Chitara. And of course, in Buganda, that was the nail on the coffin, we might say. Benedicto Kiwanuka's wife was a Bunyoro, and that type of family connection in southern Bunyoro was also often raised in the Luganda press as a way of delegitimizing his loyalties to the Kabaka. And once that event happened, it was very, very difficult for Kiwanuka to overcome after that. And I do think for Kabaka Mutesa, I do think he genuinely struggled with that, because I actually think that Kabaka Mutesa and Benedicto Kiwanuka got along very well in private. And I think even before he died in mysterious circumstances in the late 1960s, Mutesa would often reflect on this. And I actually think it was a tremendous regret. And Lubowa, who was advisor to the Kabaka and became the Omulamuzi after 1964, would often talk about this, that Mutesa would say to him, I really think we mishandled the Catholic question in Buganda at that time. But of course, after 1966, the game changed, and it was very difficult to go back and to make things right.
Thank you very much.
And if, Jonathan, if you have a follow-up to that, and maybe you disagree or have insights that I don't know, I would be very interested to hear.
No, I don't have any disagreement so far. It seems from his biography that Kabaka does really share those sentiments you just stated about his relationship with Kiwanuka. There is another fellow whose monograph you've written about, is Abump Mayanja. Equally, it seems to share, those sentiments. And I don't know how today the Catholic question in Uganda, I mean, what do you feel it is being addressed, say with the appointment of about 3 to 4 Catholic prime ministers, given the history that you just shared? And how has that probably today made Mengo feel about Bobby Wine now, who has often in time sounded as someone in need of support from his own in order to liberate his own as well as the rest of Uganda? It seems to me Mengo is a bit apprehensive, how to do it, but when it's about his background, is it about his intellectual capacity or abilities? I don't know how you would view that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's another excellent question. So I know Aloysius Luboa would often say to me, and may he rest in peace, that the Mengo of today was not the Mengo of the late 1950s. And that I think today in Mengo, unless I am mistaken, it would be very difficult for the reasons you've identified with the appointment of Catholic catechitos to make public decrees against the Catholic Church in a way that happened in the early 1960s. I can't imagine that would happen today. What I have been interested to see, though, is that Benedicto Kiwanuka struggled to navigate Muslim politics, and he struggled to navigate his relationship with Omulangira Badru Kakungulu. And what I've noticed is that Bobby Wine, by contrast, organized a high-profile meeting with Omulangira Nachibinge as a way of, I think, trying to break down any existing religious boundaries that continue to shape national politics or even kingdom politics in Uganda and Buganda today. So when I think about what has changed between the early 1960s and today, and there are a lot of things, of course, have changed, of course, I do think the role of Islamic politics in the country and even the extent to which Catholic activists like Bobby Wine have tried to create Muslim solidarities looks differently today. Because I think Benedicto Kiwanuka, he tried to incorporate Muslim leadership within the Democratic Party to create a national movement. And this goes to, I believe, Professor Muhozi's question about the way in which the DP would become a national party. But I do think in all actuality, Benedicto Kiwanuka operated with very real prejudice against Muslim communities. And I think that was a real struggle of the party. And in turn, YKY was so effective at incorporating Abubakar Mayanja, incorporating Omulangira Badru Kakungulu in a way that really undermined the Democratic Party and the attempt of the Democratic Party to become a national movement. And I think to Professor Muhozi's question, thinking about this more, this is one of the reasons why I'm interested in the history of electoral practices in West Nile, because this was clearly the most Catholic region of the country, but they were unable to attract, the Democratic Party was unable to attract electoral victory in West Nile. And I think on the one hand, why this was the case is Benedicto Kiwanuka in party leadership in Kampala and in Entebbe took their victory there for granted. So the UPC actually had a very aggressive campaigning strategy in West Nile. They were incredibly effective. but they were also much more effective at incorporating Muslim leadership in West Nile in a way that the DP just felt they didn't have to do. And that came back to proverbially bite them, as we might say.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for those responses. I don't know if Christopher I don't know if you wanted to follow up on your question.
Thank you.
Or if Jonathan has answered it.
Thank you very much, Edgar, and thank you so much, Jonathan. I think John answered my question. Like I was trying to ask myself, so given the story in Ankole, given what we've heard about what was happening in Teso, to what extent was DP a national party? But having that in mind, I also started thinking, so what was the social basis, or if you like, the social political base of DP as a political party? If it was without Buganda, some political parties have an ethnic following here in Uganda. So if it was without Buganda, in spite of the fact that it was led by Muganda, if it was without DP, if we can, somewhere in your talk, you tried to kind of suggest that we shouldn't so much look at DP so much as a Catholic party, trying to destabilize that common narrative, DP equaling Catholic Church party or Catholic Church supported party. So if we say then DP was without, if we divorce DP from the Catholic Church, and then it's without Buganda, so what was the basis of its political power? I was wondering whether, if John, you can spend some little time talking about that. Thank you so much.
No, thank you very much, Professor Muhoozi. Christopher, that is an excellent question, and it is one I continue to think about. What we see with the Democratic Party throughout Uganda is that it made numerous political alliances that are not always systematic. They're not always direct. So, for example, in Bunyoro, the Democratic Party, Benedicto Kiwanuka, will support the return of the lost counties. In Buganda, it is the case that Kiwanuka does adopt a certain type of anti-kingship position. Even in one private memo, he writes that you should remove kings entirely from political life in Uganda if they intrude in constitutional practices. And he was writing this before 1966. In Tesoland, he tries to identify with a certain republicanism. It doesn't quite play out because they struggle to get beyond the cities. They struggle to really get beyond Soroti. In Western Uganda, they really aligned themselves, the DP, with the Rwenzururu secessionist movement because they felt that more Catholics backed the Rwenzururu movement than Protestants were supporting the total monarchy. So in Western Uganda, Kiwanuka and the Democratic Party was basically arguing that the UPC would back the total monarchy, but Rwenzururu would be a predominantly Catholic movement. And when Kiwanuka is spending time on the Uganda-Congo border, he's spending a lot of time with Rwenzururu dissenters as he's trying to capitalize upon that social base of dissent within the total kingdom. In Ankole, as your historical scholarship in your work shows effectively, the position of the Democratic Party is to back the Ankole monarchy, if I'm reading it correctly. And the Catholic or the Democratic Party will get behind the appointment of a Catholic prime minister in 1961 within Ankole. So in that point, they're actually much more pro-monarchy because the Catholic Church is much more aligned in that direction. And again, I think, of course, your scholarship and work speaks to that much more authoritatively than my understanding. But in Chigezi, by contrast, the Democratic Party becomes associated with the Hutu revolution of the late 1950s. And so in many ways, what I'm beginning to see is that there was many lives to the Democratic Party, and there were many hats that Benedicto Kiwanuka wore. And he cannot be reduced into a singular national project, because he struggled to navigate all of these competing communities and try to create them into this unified movement. To some extent, he does try to use the Catholic Church as a unifying effort. But what he finds very quickly is that Catholic experiences throughout Uganda were incredibly diverse. It looked incredibly differently. And I think he did not fully appreciate that, at least in Teso land. I think he didn't quite fully calculate that Catholic culture among the Mill Hill community looked very differently than the Catholic culture of the White Fathers in Buganda. The Catholic community in Buganda was especially hierarchical, especially under the leadership of Joseph Kiwanuka, Archbishop Kiwanuka. And if I may go back to this image that I have here, see if I can pull it quickly, because I think it is an insightful picture. Let me pull it quickly. That I think this was the type of understanding that Kiwanuka had, and thought this is what he would encounter in Teso, this very real sense of hierarchy that would look toward the archbishop and the bishops, when in reality it was far more decentralized in Eastern Uganda. So I think those were some of the types of differences in the social bases that Kiwanuka encountered in late 1950s, early 1960s Uganda. It's a great question.
There are two, I think, related questions here from Henry Malindwa and Nicholas Tunanuche. And if I could ask them to each ask their questions in turn. Henry Malindwa has written that, no, you cannot divorce the Catholic Church from the beginning of the DP. And then Nicholas has a comment asking about ideas of tribalism in Bukede writ large. So I wonder if Henry Malindwa, if you'd like to say something, and then Nicholas, and then we'll let John respond.
Yes, I'm Henry in southern Uganda. I wouldn't think that you can divorce the beginning of the Catholic Church, the beginning of the DP from the Catholic Church. As Jonathon said, that there was this fight for social justice. Catholics were being left out in politics. They couldn't get the good jobs. The only jobs they could get, maybe to be justice, to be lawyers, but otherwise they could not get into the political space. So they began a party in order to fight for social justice. And that's why later, even Muslims, because they had also been sidelined by the Protestant politics, so later Muslims also joined the DP. So that's why I said you cannot divorce not the Catholic Church as such, but the Catholic people from the beginning of the Democratic Party in Uganda. Thank you.
Thank you. And before I ask Nicholas to jump in, you've jogged my memory here in thinking in your comment, Jonathan, about West Nile, that it's someone like Felix Onama, who does have a position in the colonial civil service and a patronage network and other connections, who's able to mobilize support in West Nile that maybe isn't the case for Catholics in other parts of the country. Nicholas, has asked about political tribalism. Would you like to pose your question?
Nicholas, are you there?
I am, but my background needs quite press.
Oh, we can hear you.
So
Oh.
Edgar, I would be,
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
If Nicholas is unable to speak, I would be happy to read his question and to speak and think alongside him and Mulindwa with their excellent points and insights. So I think Mulindwa, that is correct, and certainly it was a challenge, certainly in Uganda, that Kiwanuka tried to overcome and trying to move the party away from the Catholic Church, or at least its associations in public politics with the Catholic Church. You also raised an important point in the comments, and that is the type of political solidarities that existed between Lira and Tesoland. And there's no doubt there are ways in which Milton Obote and Obwangor are working to exploit those long historical relationships between Lira and Tesoland, and kind of the complexity of Lira and Soroti politics, and kind of long-term existing trade networks and spaces of linguistic and cultural exchange. So I think, you know, that's an excellent point in terms of regional solidarities that you raise. Nicholas, your point is interesting. Uganda historians of the early 1900s and Uganda administrators of the early 1900s wrote and organized with a certain sense or certain idea of Uganda civilization or political progress in Uganda. And the way in which Hemu Mukasa or Apollo Kagwa or James Meaty would often write was in a way that underscored a long history of political development in Uganda, unlike the area that would become pejoratively termed Bukedi. So in time, colonial administrators, borrowing from the scripts of Uganda writers, created various administrative pejorative terminologies as a way of legitimizing what many had called the sub-imperialism of Uganda throughout the remaining sections of the country. So the language of inherent tribalism was a particular political nomenclature with which administrators sought to legitimize the administration of areas, including most certainly Tesoland, although of course the arguments very quickly proved problematic as Kakungulu sought to expand the colonial protectorate into eastern Uganda. So thank you for drawing that point. There's also a question, Edgar, that I see that, let's see, I was going to, all right, so Galabuzi Mukasa asks, isn't the Catholic Church replacing NUP for DP? And this is a question I would be interested to hear from maybe Mukasa, if you can speak to this, or Edgar, or anyone who is in a position to speak to this. I'm not sure to what extent the Catholic Church is actively getting behind the movement. I can't really speak to that, and if anyone has insights into that, kind of the politics of religious solidarities with Bobby Wine, I would be interested to hear them. That's a little bit beyond my current expertise. It's a great question, though.
Well, I wonder if Herman, if you'd like to, has sort of added on to this in his comment. I don't know if Herman, if you'd like to intervene here. And
yeah, yes, Hediger. Don't know if you can hear me now.
yes.
can, yes. Yeah, my concern is I would like to thank John for the well presented paper. I'm just wondering because political parties emerge sometimes depending on the situations. Like for DP, we know how the situation was in Uganda at that time and how the Catholics felt they were marginalized, etc., etc. So most political parties, when you read their origin and formation, there is always a foundation. And so that happened to the DP. But of course, the ears of the DP leadership has always been on ground. So they've had on the comments and the criticisms that they were basically for Dinia Papa, you know, for Baganda and the Catholics. And they've tried in a way to sort of rebrand the party when they elected Sevana Chizito, a Protestant, to take over leadership. I think that is 2005. And recently, it is now Norbert Mao, who is from the Acholi. But when you look at it, the party hasn't really, you know, tried to, this hasn't changed anything. And whereas by the time we went into the 1996 general elections, DP was the main opposition party. Right now, it is not even the second one. So does Edgar or John want to comment on that? What would be the problem? I mean, what would help the party if it really wants to rebrand and become with a national face? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Herman, for that question. If I may quickly address the historical point, and I would note that in the late 1950s, Benedicto Kiwanuka and the Democratic Party did in fact try to nationalize the face of the party. I think they found it exceptionally difficult to do that, but it was not without effort. Within the senior leadership of the party, there were ways in which they were actively recruiting Protestants. There were ways in which they were trying to move beyond Uganda, but the politics of stereotypes became very difficult to overturn. Norbert Mao and Herman, I think this is where your point raises a question for me, and maybe some of you have a better explanation than I do. I've never been able to quite understand why Norbert Mao has not become more popular than what he is. In 2010 at the Buganda conference, I remember him giving an excellent address in Uganda for the cause of federal, and yet even then he doesn't seem to have attracted large amounts of popularity throughout Uganda. And similarly throughout Uganda, it's been very difficult for him to attract and develop a national movement around himself. And I'm not entirely sure why that's the case.
I see that Henry Malindwa has his hand up. Henry, do you want to contribute?
Yes, I would think that the politics of religion is going down, thank God. So that's why I would think that could be the reason why we shouldn't even say that, oh, the NUP is replacing the DP. The way the NUP came into existence has nothing to do with how the DP came into existence. Today, the dynamics are different. People of my generation who are 50 years below have not seen that life where you bypass a school which is near you because it's a Protestant school or a Catholic school and I'm Protestant, or it's a Protestant school, a Muslim school and I'm Catholic. Those days are going down. So I think that's a good thing. So the Democratic Party can come up in a different code, not the way it started. The same with the UPC, now it's almost wiped out. Again, it was during the time where religion played a very big role. But having the NRM government for 35 years, where political parties have been largely curtailed. So now we have new dynamics. So I'm happy that, for one thing, that the politics of religion is going down. I'm very happy for that, but I'm not happy that the current government has been clipping political parties, and yet poses as if there is a kind of full-blown democracy here. I know we are discussing history, not politics today. Thank you.
Thank you. We're just closing in on our allotted time, but I wonder if Deo, if you could articulate your comments from the chat, and then we'll give Jonathan a chance to respond before we wrap up.
Yes, thank you so much, Prof. Yes, I think your paper corrects this common mistake that most scholars have really made, that the Democratic Party was a Catholic party. I find it a bit outrageous. DP, from its inception, like most of the commentators have said, is formed to fight marginalization that was being, pushed on it by the colonial state, which was working hand in hand with the Anglican Party. That is why you see it's changing and its voting patterns. You'll note that in 1962, DP was very unpopular in Uganda. You note very well that Kiwanuka himself was on collusion course with the Meng establishment, on collusion course with the Anglican Church, on collusion course with the political state. And therefore, a man who had won the previous election was taken to be bad. And these are elements that you bring out very well in the paper. Then how does it happen that in 1980, DP became popular? So what we need to really understand is that the patterns, the voting trends, and acceptance, conditions for DP are dictated by their interests. That is why they vary from the region to ethnicity. I think this also addresses the common still mistake that people really make, that DP is a Uganda party. There are so many people from those you have mentioned in the paper. There are Bongoris and others. Senteza Kajubi, the Sebana Kizitos, the Nobati Mawos, and many others that are not coming in Uganda. They are not trying to correct a historical mistake. They are shifting their positions depending on their interests and what they are crusading for. That is the quick comment I wanted to make, Prof. Thank you.
So, Jonathan, if I could be very unfair and just ask you to respond in like 60 seconds, because we're just coming out of time, and then we'll wrap up. Thank you.
No, thank you, Edgar. No, I think Dale has raised an excellent point about the importance of thinking about not always our organizations and individuals trying to, at least in their thinking, correct historical mistakes, but they have active, ongoing political agendas and priorities that change with time. And I think that Dale has very elegantly put to the point, and I'm very grateful for that point. And maybe I could just say, again, to say many thanks to everyone for coming and attending. I know that there are many things you could be doing right now, and I would also pray and wish all of you the best during this very interesting, these days of COVID, and we hope that it will all be over soon.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan, for your very rich presentation and a really fascinating discussion. And thank you to everyone who has attended and contributed. I think we've all, I've taken away a lot from this, and as I'm sure we all have. So we thank you very much. And as I said, I hope that someday you'll be able to do this again with us in person. But in the meantime, we will, of course, stay in touch. There was a question earlier in the chat about the availability of your book, and I wonder if you might just say something briefly about how can, I know that your first book is available in an online format through the university library, but how might, when the Contesting Catholics book comes out, how might it be accessible?
So we're going to work with Fountain to get we're going to work very hard to try to get a paperback copy that is available in Uganda, and also at a reasonable price. That is our goal. So it will be published in April, and then we're beginning that conversation to get things moving in that direction so that it's more easily accessible to our friends and colleagues and readers in Uganda, of course. So we're looking forward to that.
Well, thanks so much. I'll look forward to seeing it on the shelves sometime next year. And thank you everyone for attending. And the history seminar will resume next semester. We're putting together a lineup. If you have anyone who you'd like to see us invite, or if you yourself would like to present your ongoing work, please contact me by email. It's in the poster for this talk, and we'll work that into the schedule. So thank you again, and I look forward to seeing you all virtually or in person sometime soon.
Thank you.
And a virtual round of applause.